Have you ever stopped to notice just how far the human brain is willing to go to protect its own ego?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it is genuinely capable of performing these incredible, like Olympic level mental gymnastics just to avoid facing a difficult truth about itself.
Right, right.
Because we all have this built-in psychological defense system. You know, it,
Yeah.
it it refuses to let us look in the mirror when we know deep down we aren't going to like the reflection looking back at us.
Absolutely.
So instead of dealing with our own, historical shames or our deep-seated insecurities, what do? We take all of that heavy, uncomfortable baggage and we aggressively pin it onto somebody else.
Yeah, it's a survival mechanism, fundamentally,
Yeah.
but a really highly destructive one.
Yeah.
Because when we look at history, we tend to think of conflicts primarily in terms of physical battles, right? Like shifting borders, military strategy.
Sure.
But the most pervasive, enduring conflicts, they're almost always fought on the battlefield of linguistics.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this because we are heading into a deeply intense and, frankly, unexpected historical journey today for this deep dive.
We are.
Our mission is to look into the roots of one of the most toxic, explosive words in the English language, specifically the hard R.
Right.
And by tracing its linguistic and historical roots, we're going to uncover what is essentially a massive, centuries-old case of hidden class warfare and, like we said, profound psychological projection.
It's a huge topic.
It is. But before we get into the weeds, I do want to be incredibly clear with everyone listening.
Yeah.
We are navigating heavily charged historical territory here.
Yes, we are.
We're dealing with racial slurs, extreme bigotry, and class subjugation. So we are acting strictly as impartial observers today.
Exactly.
We aren't here to take a political side or to endorse the horrifying viewpoints of the historical figures we'll be discussing. We are simply reporting on the historical and etymological data to understand how this language was engineered.
And that is a crucial baseline to establish because this isn't just about the evolution of a single word. It's really a masterclass in understanding how and why power structures manipulate language to maintain control.
Right.
When you understand the architecture of how a linguistic tool was built, you understand exactly how to dismantle it.
Yeah.
And to do that, we have to start with the psychological engine driving it all.
Right, right. To understand how a word acquires that kind of, I don't know, world-bending power, we have to look at how the human ego protects itself. Because the sources we have, they define this concept of psychological projection beautifully.
Hmm.
It is the act of taking your own deepest insecurities, your historical shames, or your terrifying feelings of low status and projecting them outward.
Right.
You essentially make your internal rot someone else's problem, so you never had to confront it yourself.
And this tactic has a very dark, a very well-documented lineage, especially when it's weaponized by the state. If you look at the historical context of propaganda, you see this strategy employed repeatedly. Take Paul Joseph Goebbels in the 1930s and 40s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one of the foundational directives famously tied to that era of propaganda is the instruction to accuse the other side of that which you are guilty.
Jeez.
It's a brilliant, albeit nefarious, strategy because it creates an immediate smokescreen.
Yeah, it totally disorients the opponent.
Yeah.
You put them on the defensive for the exact crime you are committing.
Precisely. On a macro level, a societal level, it allows a ruling class or an oppressive regime to commit atrocities while convincingly broadcasting to the public that the other marginalized group is the one possessing those exact negative traits.
Wow.
The burden of defense is shifted entirely to the innocent party, but we can't forget that this operates just as fiercely on a micro individual level.
Right, because the human ego cannot tolerate the continuous pain of guilt or the sheer terror of low social status.
Right.
So it aggressively exports that pain onto anyone within reach. To put this in like everyday, relatable terms, it's kind of like dealing with a truly terrible roommate.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? We've all had or heard of that one roommate who is just a complete disaster. They leave their dirty dishes in the sink for weeks, laundry everywhere. The apartment is basically a biohazard because of them.
Right, right.
But the very second you leave a single washed coffee mug on the counter to dry, they absolutely blow up at you.
They lose it.
Yes. They start screaming about how you were always making the house a mess and disrespecting the shared space.
Yeah.
It's maddening. But when you look at it through this lens, it's a textbook defense mechanism. They're drowning in their own shame about being a chaotic mess. But instead of actually doing the work to clean up, They project that shame onto you so they can experience a fleeting moment of superiority.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The unhinged anger they direct at you over a coffee mug is actually the compounded anger they feel toward their own inadequacies. They aren't really yelling at you. They are yelling at their own reflection.
Wow.
But if we take that dynamic and scale it up, this is where the history gets incredibly dark, but deeply revealing.
Okay.
If a single roommate can project their deepest shames onto you to protect their fragile ego, we have to ask, what happens when an entire social class does it?
Oh, man.
When a massive demographic of people feels profound existential anxiety about their economic and social status, how does that collective insecurity physically manifest in the language they use?
Which brings us to the actual origin story of the slur itself.
Yes.
Because there is this widespread cultural assumption that the hard R has only ever walked one straight path through history. Like, we assume it was created by white people exclusively to subjugate black people, full stop.
Right.
But the archives reveal a much more complex, frankly ironic timeline about how the wealthy ruling class actually used this word to control multiple demographics.
Yes. The etymological record tells a story of intentional mutation. The base of the word traces back to the 16th and 17th centuries, derived from the Latin adjective niger, which simply meant black.
Right.
In its earliest forms in English, it was used as a descriptive term. But as the transatlantic slave trade industrialized, the word was systematically weaponized to justify the brutal subjugation of black people.
Yeah.
It ceased to be a simple physical descriptor and was engineered by those in power into a vicious racial slur. In the societal architecture of the time, it became the ultimate linguistic marker for the absolute bottom of the hierarchy.
Right. I mean, it meant you were property. It meant you had zero legal rights, zero bodily autonomy, zero status. It was the absolute floor of society.
That's the core of it. And because that word represented the lowest possible social standing in the minds of the wealthy elite, they realized they had forged a weapon of immense psychological power.
Right.
They didn't just restrict its use to enslaved black people.
Okay, here we go.
This brings us to a crucial linguistic twist in the 19th century. A secondary phrase emerged heavily in the lexicon of the British and American ruling classes. The phrase was white nigger.
Okay, just to pause and highlight this for everyone listening, notice the deliberate combination of those two words. White, followed by the exact same hard R.
Yes.
This was the massive aha moment for me when reviewing the historical data. Wealthy elites began using this combined phrase as an aggressive, highly targeted classist slur.
Exactly.
And they weren't throwing it at black people. They were hurling it at lower-class, impoverished white individuals who were performing brutal, backbreaking, menial labor.
Right. Yeah, to understand the weight of this, we have to look closely at who the primary targets of this phrase were in the 1800s.
Okay, who was it?
The historical archives point heavily toward marginalized immigrant groups, most notably the influx of impoverished Irish immigrants.
Oh, wow.
During this period, the wealthy British and American elites viewed the Irish as essentially a lower, almost subhuman tier of existence.
Right.
The conditions these laborers lived and worked in were horrific. I mean, starvation wages, dangerous industrial environments, extreme poverty.
Yeah.
So by looking at an impoverished Irish laborer and calling them that secondary phrase, the elites were sending a very explicit, terrifying message.
They were essentially saying, yes, you possess white skin, but make no mistake, we view your social status, your economic worth, and your basic humanity as absolutely identical to that of an oppressed black person.
Exactly that. It was a linguistic leash.
It is, but I have a hard time wrapping my head around the motivation here, though. Like, was this just casual cruelty?
Well,
Did the ruling class invent this usage purely because they enjoyed mocking people in the dirt? Or was there a tangible strategic utility for the elites to tie poor whites to the absolute lowest social rung? Because it just feels like a lot of effort just to be mean.
no, it was entirely strategic, and it was rooted in the profound paranoia of the elite class. Yes, this brings us directly into the architecture of a deliberate divide-and-conquer trap. Think about the demographics of the 19th century. The wealthy elites were a microscopic minority in terms of population.
Right, the vast majority were poor.
Exactly. The vast majority consisted of desperately poor white laborers and enslaved or deeply oppressed black laborers.
Okay.
If those two massive groups, both of whom were enduring brutal conditions orchestrated by the same wealthy class, if they ever realized they shared a common enemy, the power structure would collapse overnight.
Oh, I see. They could easily unite and overthrow the elites.
You have to introduce a psychological trap that prevents solidarity.
So the elites are sitting there realizing they are vastly outnumbered,
Yeah.
and they have to make sure the people at the bottom hate each other more than they hate the people pulling the string.
You've hit the nail on the head. By threatening poor white laborers with this language, by calling them that secondary slur, the elites triggered a profound existential status anxiety. The poor white laborers were desperate, absolutely desperate, to prove they weren't at the very bottom of the social barrel.
Right, because the elites are basically holding a mirror up to their poverty and saying, you are one bad week away from being viewed as property.
Yes.
That level of anxiety has to go somewhere.
And this is where the mass societal projection we discussed earlier takes hold.
Okay.
To distance themselves from the bottom, to prove to the elites, and perhaps more importantly to themselves, that they were superior, the poor white laborers fully adopted the most vicious racial slurs.
Wow.
They took all of their own historical wounds, their own subjugation at the hands of the rich, their own suffocating low-status anxiety, and they projected it completely onto Black people.
Jeez.
It was a desperate psychological attempt to carve out a buffer zone between themselves and the absolute bottom of society.
I'm trying to think of a modern parallel to this, and it really reminds me of toxic corporate middle management.
Okay, I like this.
You know the exact dynamic I'm talking about. You have these middle managers who are hovering near the bottom of the corporate ladder, and the CEO treats them terribly.
Right.
They are overworked, drastically underpaid, and constantly demeaned by the executive suite.
Yeah.
But instead of pushing back against the CEO, because that requires courage and actively threatens their livelihood, they turn around and fiercely punch down at the unpaid interns.
Exactly.
They make the interns' lives an absolute misery just to prove to themselves, hey, at least I'm not that guy. I have someone beneath me.
Right?
The poor white laborers in the 19th century were essentially the middle management of the class structure, punching down desperately to avoid looking at their own exploitation.
That is a phenomenal way to contextualize it. And to push your corporate analogy even further, the CEO doesn't just casually benefit from that dynamic.
Oh, they rely on it.
They actively rely on it. If the middle manager is busy screaming at the intern, they are entirely too distracted to notice they haven't had a raise in 5 years.
Yeah.
They certainly aren't teaming up with the intern to form a union or demand better working conditions from the executive suite.
Wow. So the poor white laborers traded the immense power of solidarity for a cheap, false sense of superiority.
And the true tragedy of this historical era is that they enthusiastically embraced the very linguistic tools that were designed to keep them subservient. They did the elite's dirty work for them.
Man, okay, this historical context is fascinating and frankly a bit tragic.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder about the echoes of this today. Because obviously society looks very different now. The Industrial Revolution is over. The demographic makeup has shifted.
Sure.
Can we still see the ghosts of this 19th century class warfare in modern behavior? Or is this just an interesting historical footnote?
Oh, we absolutely can still see it. And it reveals itself most clearly when the societal mask slips.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when you analyze modern usage of this slur, particularly in moments of raw, unfiltered anger, a very telling, almost biological pattern emerges. If you observe internal, heated arguments among certain groups, for example, in spaces associated with white supremacy, extreme far-right echo chambers, or even just visceral arguments caught on camera between people harboring this kind of prejudice.
Yeah.
Something fascinating happens when their tempers flare against their own people.
What do they do?
They drop the white qualifier entirely. They will hurl the exact same hard R at another white person.
Yes. The historical data points this out. And this is where the history gets incredibly dark, but deeply revealing.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting, folks. When they drop that qualifier and hurl that word at each other, it is textbook Goebbels-level projection happening in real time.
Right.
Because think about the specific traits that white supremacists and racists constantly try to project onto Black people to justify their bigotry. They claim inherent traits of inferiority, low societal status, lack of intelligence, or subservience.
Exactly.
But historically speaking, those are the exact wounds of class oppression that their own working-class white ancestors suffered at the hands of the wealthy elites.
It is the ultimate historical irony.
It really is.
They are taking a word whose entire psychological power was engineered by the elite class to degrade the working class poor, and they continually project it outward to maintain this historical scapegoat.
Yeah.
The person screaming that word genuinely believes that they are demonstrating dominance, right? Projecting strength and asserting their rightful place at the top of a racial hierarchy.
But they're not.
No. In reality, to anyone who understands etymology, they are doing the exact opposite. They are exposing their own inherited, unhealed class anxieties.
It's a massive multi-generational cell phone. By using the slur, they are unwittingly resurrecting the very weapon that was used by wealthy British and American elites to keep their own ancestors starving in the dirt.
Exactly.
They're literally shouting, "I am terrified of being at the bottom of the social ladder," but they actually think they sound powerful and in control.
It exposes a profound, almost tragic lack of historical awareness. The aggression, the volume, the vitriol, it is all just a brittle shield for ancestral trauma. When you understand the etymology and the class warfare behind it, the word ceases to be a terrifying display of power. It becomes a very sad, incredibly transparent display of deep-seated insecurity.
I follow the logic completely, but this brings up a huge logistical question for me. I need to play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If this information is so powerful, if understanding this 19th century context completely shifts the power dynamic of the word and exposes the projection, why isn't this widely taught?
Right.
Like, why isn't this the very first thing that pops up on Wikipedia or Google when you do a quick internet search about the history of the word?
You're touching on something crucial there, and it brings us to a concept we can call the geography of information.
The geography of information. Okay.
Finding this deeper historical context today can often feel like you are hunting for deliberately hidden or suppressed data.
Yeah, it does.
If you go onto slandered American servers, Google, Bing, the typical search engines based and operated in the US, and you search for the historical usage of these terms, the results you get are fundamentally altered.
Oh, well.
They are either highly sanitized or they are buried under absolute mountains of algorithmic data designed to prioritize current modern political discourse.
Because the algorithms are financially incentivized to feed us what causes engagement today. And modern political outrage drives way more clicks and ad revenue than nuanced 19th century class dynamics.
Precisely. The algorithms prioritize the current cultural temperature, and right now the cultural temperature is focused on the immediate emotional impact of the word, not its architectural history.
Right.
But our sources provide a very specific, actionable piece of intelligence for anyone wanting to bypass this.
Okay, wait on me.
If you want to get past that sanitized algorithmic layer, you have to deliberately change your digital geography. The text suggests using a privacy-focused search engine, DuckDuckGo, is specifically mentioned, and actively switching your region settings to the United Kingdom.
I have to stop you there because I want to make sure I'm understanding the mechanics of this.
Yeah.
Are you seriously telling me that just toggling a region setting in a browser completely bypasses massive algorithmic filters?
Yes.
How does that actually work? Because it sounds a bit too much like a magic trick.
It's not magic, it's a reflection of how physical history was digitized. It comes down to where the history actually occurred and, crucially, who kept the records.
Okay.
When you switch your search engine to the UK region, you are telling the algorithm to prioritize databases located there.
Yeah.
Suddenly, a wealth of older historical archives, British colonial texts, exhaustive parliamentary records, and deep etymological studies regarding the treatment of the Irish working class pop right up.
Okay, so the information isn't actually invisible,
Yeah.
and it hasn't been scrubbed from the earth in some massive conspiracy.
No, not at all. It's just geographically archived in the region where those historical class wars were most heavily documented.
That makes sense.
The British elites of the 18th and 19th centuries were meticulous, almost obsessive record keepers of their colonial and class-based activities. They documented exactly how they viewed and treated their labor forces.
Right.
This raises an incredibly important question for all of us as modern consumers of information. How much of our understanding of history, and consequently our understanding of our current social dynamics, is being shaped, constrained, or outright hidden by the geographic and commercial biases of our search algorithms?
That is wild to think about. I mean, we walk around with these supercomputers in our pockets, completely convinced we have the entirety of the world's knowledge at our fingertips.
Right.
But in reality, we often just have access to the specific knowledge that a server farm in California has determined is most profitable and relevant to our current political climate.
Exactly.
By accepting that filtered view, we are completely missing the historical context that actually defangs the hatred.
Information literacy is paramount. It's not just about knowing how to read, it's about knowing where to look. You have to know how to find the root of the tree, not just endlessly stare at the leaves that are falling today.
Which perfectly sets up the culmination of all this. Now that we have retrieved this hidden data, now that we understand the history of the elite's linguistic manipulation and the mechanics of the projection, how does a listener actually apply this knowledge?
Right.
The focus here is that education is elevation.
Right.
This is about taking the power back from the word entirely.
The overarching theme here, and the real takeaway, is that life has a beautiful, almost poetic way of handing you ammunition when you take the time to seek out the truth.
Yeah.
When someone hurls that word today out of sheer, unadulterated ignorance, they fully believe they are asserting dominance over you.
They do.
They think they hold the historical high ground and that they are inflicting a deep, unanswerable wound. But armed with this truth, you realize they are doing the exact opposite.
They aren't wielding power, they're just recycling a rusty tool of elite-class warfare. A tool that was originally designed to mock people just like them, to keep poor laborers fighting each other in the dirt so the wealthy could continue to exploit them.
Let's unpack that further, because when you recognize that reality, it fundamentally alters your psychological and biological response to the word.
Right.
Once you realize that the entire weight, terror, and supposed dominance of the word actually relies on a historical system of wealthy elites mocking poor, desperate laborers, the word completely loses its ability to cause you anger.
It shifts your reaction entirely. The sources describe this transformation beautifully. It shifts you from a state of raw emotional hurt to a state of quiet, clinical knowing.
That's it.
I find that phrasing so powerful. Quiet, clinical knowing.
It is a profound shift in perspective. It's the difference between reacting to a physical threat and calmly observing a symptom of a disease.
Wow.
When someone uses that language against you, you are no longer the victim of their slur. You become an educated, almost scientific observer of their historical projection.
That is so empowering.
Knowledge is truly most valuable when it is applied to our daily lives. And in this specific case, understanding the history turns what was carefully designed to be a weapon back into a dusty, ineffective historical artifact.
It neutralizes it on contact.
It really does.
For our listeners, the people who tune in because they genuinely love to learn, who want to bypass the noise and gain multiple deeper perspectives, this is exactly why we do these deep dives.
Absolutely.
Elevating your education directly and permanently elevates your perspective. Nobody can use their own ignorance to pull you down into the mud when you can clearly see the strings of history attached to their words.
Right.
You see the puppet master of the 19th century elite class, not just the angry puppet standing in front of you.
And perhaps more importantly, you realize the puppet is hopelessly tangling itself in his own strings.
Yeah.
The more you understand the architecture of these societal traps, the less the noise and vitriol of the world can shake you. You step entirely outside of the psychological trap that was set centuries before you were even born.
It really is the ultimate mirror. We started this journey by talking about the human ego and psychological projection, and we end up realizing that the people using this incredibly toxic language are just frantically reflecting their own unhealed historical wounds.
Exactly.
It completely flips the script on what we thought we knew about power and language. But it leaves me with a lingering thought, something for all of us to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
What's that?
If a word with this much supposed power, a word that causes so much modern, visceral reaction and societal pain, is actually just a recycled tool of 19th century elite class anxiety, what other toxic labels, political insults, or modern slurs are we currently using today that are secretly just inherited projections of someone else's historical shame?
That is the question.
Right. How much of our modern outrage, on all sides of the societal spectrum, is just us unwittingly playing out the old, dusty scripts written by historical elites? Think about that the next time you hear a label being weaponized in the news or online. Are we actually speaking our own minds, or are we just echoing a centuries-old trap?